Okay, welcome to The Political Life. It is Wednesday, June 7th, and this is your post-debt limit political life. So we're going to focus on things Washington, D.C. today. If my voice sounds a little bit different from the one you normally hear, that's because you've got the Gold brothers, and in particular Rich Gold, talking right now from Holland and Knight, the head of the public policy group at Holland and Knight in Washington, D.C., and I've got my older brother with me today, Marty Gold from Capitol Council. Is it, Marty?
Capitol Council it is.
Capitol Council. And I am the good-looking one here. Marty is the smart one. You'll just have to take my word on that if you're listening to the podcast and not seeing me somehow. And we are here today to talk about all things debt limit, what happened, what it means, what the final deal looks like, and what it's going to do in terms of at least the rest of this session of Congress, both in terms of legislation, the appropriations bills, all that sort of stuff. And politically, as we're already seeing Speaker McCarthy get some blowback from the MAGA, part of the Freedom Caucus that is raising concerns, and yesterday on the floor, or kept a bill from getting to the floor in the Rules Committee to make clear the fact that they're not too happy with the deal. So welcome, Marty. Glad to have you here today. And why don't I start out, if you would, you want to just go over sort of the outline of what this deal is substantively, and we can kind of go from there.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Rich, and good day to all of you who are listening. Republicans early in this Congress decided to use the debt ceiling, which was going to come due in early June of 2023, as a point of leverage to achieve reductions in federal spending, and had a fairly ambitious plan for what those reductions might look like, 10-year reductions, and going after a number of very specific programs. So they put it forward. President Biden and the congressional Democrats said, well, we don't think that you should threaten default to get these fiscal reforms. We can discuss the fiscal reforms in the context of the appropriations process that's going to come later in the year. It's irresponsible to threaten default on the U.S. debt. And so for quite a long time, refused to enter into any negotiations with the congressional Republicans. When I say congressional Republicans, I'm really talking about House Republicans, because early in this process, Senator McConnell and the rest of the Senate Republicans took a back seat to the leadership of Speaker McCarthy and the House Republicans. The dam burst, basically, in late April, when the Republicans in the House passed a piece of legislation by a 217 to 215 vote called the Limit, Save, and Grow Act, which was all the Republican priorities embraced in legislative form. It was obviously not going to pass in the Senate. It could never pass in the Senate. They wouldn't get a majority vote for that, much less 60 votes. And it obviously was not going to be approved by President Biden, but it did raise the debt ceiling, and it instigated, one might say, the negotiations that the Republicans had sought for some time and which President Biden had refused to have. So that bill passed in the House on April 26th, and the negotiations began very shortly thereafter, which essentially took most of May, culminating in a deal in principle, reduced to legislative form, and finally known as the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which passed the House on the 31st of May by a substantial vote of both parties. There were Democratic dissenters and very noisy Republican dissenters. Then it passed the Senate by 63 votes on the 2nd of June. So that's been the broad framework of what has happened here. Within that framework, there's quite a bit to say in terms of the substance of what was finally achieved, which is significantly narrower than what the Republicans originally sought, but I suppose you could say broader than what the White House at first preferred to see.
Thanks, Marty. That's a great sum up. So we've got budget caps involved in this. A little bit of NEPA reform, not the full permitting reform that was originally talked about. Obviously, some changes to the work requirements in TANF and SNAP. And probably most importantly among those, from a congressional perspective moving forward, is having the 2-year 302A allocation sort of agreed to up front to get going on appropriate bills. But what do you see being the outcome of this, both from let's take the legislative perspective first in terms of the outlook for the appropriations process and other legislation as we move forward this year? Is this going to be sort of the beginning of grass shoots or green shoots for bipartisan legislation moving forward? Is it going to help on things like the appropriations bills, which I guess would be most likely, but even things like FAA reauthorization and some of the other big things that have to happen this year? What do you see the outcome being in that space?
It's very complicated. It's a very complicated situation, I am afraid. Look, this was a bipartisan deal on the debt ceiling that fundamentally nobody liked. They got 314 votes in the House and 63 votes in the Senate, so significant majorities for a bill that nobody liked, because it did not go as far as many Republicans would have preferred, and it went further than many Democrats would have preferred. But they made the deal because they had to make the deal to avoid default. I don't think that it portends major bipartisan cooperation. It's not the green shoot of bipartisan cooperation for other legislation later in the year. And in fact, it's going to stimulate a number of tensions. One thing that is somewhat overlooked by the strong vote by which it passed the Senate, but is a point of great importance, was the fact that the legislation adopted President Biden's defense budget, right? The 3.3% increase in the defense budget. It sounds like an increase, but the defense hawks, particularly Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, a number of others in the Senate, made the point that inflation is greater than 3.3%. So therefore, a 3.3% increase is effectively a cut. And not only did they want to keep the defense budget on pace with inflation, they would have preferred to exceed the pace of inflation because of threats that are obviously going on from people who don't worry about these kinds of things, like the Chinese military. So they were talking in the Senate, got the Senate leadership, both parties, Schumer and McConnell, to agree that there could be supplemental appropriations bills later in the year that would have the effect of eroding the budget savings that the Fiscal Responsibility Act allegedly put in place. McCarthy pushed back on that already. He said, well, that may be what they want to do, but we're sticking with the numbers. We're sticking with the numbers in this bill. So while the Senate was absolutely not a major player in the construction of this legislation, McConnell got out of the room and got Schumer out of the room, and he allowed the negotiation to go forward between the White House and the House. Now, the Senate's going to come roaring back. And
as it always does.
As it always does. Well, there was a feeling for quite a while that in the end, the Senate would have to come in and save the situation, save the day, because somehow the White House and the House couldn't negotiate this. Well, that didn't happen. But most certainly the Senate is not going to take a back seat on this. And this question of defense spending, there are a number of other spending areas too, Democratic priorities on domestic spending that I think people would like to be addressed, that they think were unsatisfactorily addressed in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So the Democrats will have their own things they want to pass, right? But the most vivid disagreement coming out of the Senate with people who voted for this bill, okay, is on the defense spending area, because they think that they are not going to be put into a straitjacket by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and they will have an opportunity to address it later in the year through the appropriations process and through supplemental appropriations bills. And that's going to be bipartisan, by the way. That's not only Lindsey Graham or people like that, but I would suggest Jack Reed, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and others.
And
So
it's not just limited to defense, right, Marty? That would include.
no. It's a major area, not the only area.
Yeah. So one of what that raises for me, the emergency supplemental workaround, if you will. I think that would be the nice euphemism for it.
Yes.
Gaping hole might be a more accurate term. Raises the role of Shalonda Young here, who obviously as OMB director now, previously the staff director, and probably one of the most experienced appropriation staff in town, really earned her paycheck for the government, the Biden administration, the last couple of weeks with these negotiations as sort of the lead staffer, if you will, in the room, negotiating principally with Mr. McHenry and Graves from the House Republican side, and then obviously Steve Ricchetti with her from the White House. But in terms of the budget detail and getting down to the level of creative deal making, I would think Shalonda, to a great extent, was largely responsible for much of that. Any thoughts in that space?
Yeah, thank you, Rich. My thought is she deserves all the credit you just gave her, because if you think about it, and I think this is obviously what irritated a number of the Republicans who supported that bill in April that they passed in the House by 2 votes, now felt was inadequately addressed here. Or, for example, they were looking at 10 years of spending cuts, and instead they got 2 years of mandatory spending caps and a few more years of spending caps that are not mandatory, that are almost suggestions, right? Work requirements tailored way back, permitting reform tailored way back, and IRS funding reduction. Some of it was made, but not as much as what the House wanted. You can go down a whole list of things that were Republican priorities, right, that the president's team negotiated away, or at least did damage control, significant damage control on it. So if the Republicans wanted to claim credit for this bill, and of course they would, right? They say, well, Biden wanted more taxes. We didn't have any more taxes. Biden wanted to spend more this year than last year, but we spent less this year than last year. Biden was against permitting reform. Biden was against the IRS funding reductions. Biden was against addressing the work requirements. Biden was against addressing student loan moratoriums. But all these things in one fashion or another are addressed in this legislation. Biden was probably against a pay-go rule or executive branch, regulations and so forth. We put it into the bill, this kind of thing. So if you wanted to claim credit on the Republican side, if Biden wanted all those things, we gave him none of those things, including most especially the taxes, okay, which were in his budget.
And yet we seem to be getting into circular fire squad
Yeah, no, sure.
mode as opposed to taking credit for the things that did happen.
No, of course, because while it is true they wanted action in all those areas, and Biden did not. Okay. It is also true that they wanted much more extreme action in all those areas than Biden agreed to. Okay? So in the end, from an executive branch perspective, it was an exercise in damage control. The executive branch wanted one thing, the debt ceiling to rise. Right? And I would add, and not to come up again during the president's term, because that's yet another thing. The debt ceiling is now extended to January 1st, 2025. So President Biden doesn't have to have a gun to the head again in this Congress, which the Republicans in the House would have been happy to in fact do. If it had been up to the Republicans, they would have had short-term debt limit increases. And in 2024, in the middle of an election cycle, we would have been going through this exercise again. So Shalonda Young deserves all the credit you gave her, Rich, because she limited the damage on a number of these substantive areas, and she put off, we say she, ultimately it was more than her, but put off addressing the debt ceiling again until after the 2024 election. I think it's a very, very important win for the administration.
So the interesting thing to me about this is obviously this isn't the first rodeo for you or me on debt ceiling. And obviously you are considered to be one of the top Senate rules and budget experts around these environs. But it seems to me we've seen Republicans go up against Democratic administrations on this issue. And at this point, it should be self-evident at the end of the day, whether by a small or more significant margin, the Democratic president is always going to come out on top, in part structurally because Republicans just can't afford to breach the debt limit. And so when you get down to, May 27th with a June 1st deadline,
that's right.
You are in the space of take what you can get, take what you can carry and go. And that is always going to upset the purists. In this case, some of the MAGA Republicans in the Freedom Caucus, and a relatively smaller number, but enough to make a difference on close votes for certain. And we saw that yesterday with objection in the Rules Committee to proceeding forward on a separate piece of legislation, making the point that, in fact, if McCarthy is not going to follow through on what some of those folks considered to be promises that were made to them when they agreed to vote for him on the 10th or whatever it was, vote for Speaker, that they had tools they could use in the process. And do you expect we're going to see that going forward, more sort of intra-party friction based on this result?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me say it to you this way. Okay. That vote yesterday, it was a vote on a rule that would have established procedural framework for the consideration of 4 bills in the House. Now, the majority party doesn't bring forward a rule unless it knows the rule is going to pass. The last rule that failed in the House was in 2002. So more than 20 years ago, since we had a situation where a rule failed. If they don't have the votes for the rule, they don't bring the rule.
Right.
That's it. The minority party always votes against the rule, so it's up to the majority party to carry the vote. And yesterday, the rule failed 206 to 220 because 11 MAGA Republicans who trashed the debt ceiling deal, who didn't vote for the debt ceiling deal, and a number of whom also didn't vote for McCarthy for most of those ballots in the Speaker election, they rebelled in an unannounced move. In other words, they didn't say ahead of time they were going to oppose the rule. They just opposed it when the vote came. And so ultimately 12 Republicans voted against the rule because you had the 11 dissidents, plus Steve Scalise, who's the House Majority Leader, who voted against the rule so he could make a motion to reconsider the vote, which is supposed to actually come up today. The point is, it was a massive warning shot across the bow to McCarthy. We're not happy with your leadership. We're not happy with your speakership. We're not happy with the commitments that we think you made that you didn't seem to honor. You may interpret the commitments differently from us, but in fact, with the difference of opinion, we're still unhappy. So we're telling you right now, there are things that we're going to do to push back against you. One of the things that several of those folks threatened was a motion to vacate, to try to remove McCarthy from the speakership altogether. And that could happen as time goes along. But it seemed premature at the moment. So what else could they do? So here they say, well, we'll just tell the leadership, you're not pushing us around. We're going to oppose the rule. We didn't tell you ahead of time, so we're going to publicly embarrass you. And if you don't get the message, this could happen again. Or if you don't get the message, a motion to vacate could happen. So
this seems
so rebellion is in the air.
Yeah. This seems like a good time to be the minority leader in the House of Representatives. I am reminded of the great Polish proverb, not my circus, not my monkeys. Thinking of Hakeem Jeffries this week, who must be sitting back and just enjoying it all, taking it all in, maybe having a beer, watching the atmosphere get warmer and warmer on the other side of the aisle.
Well, I'm sure that is true. I'm sure that is true. And the question really becomes, what is the price of peace for McCarthy? What does he have to do? What is the price of peace?
Well, isn't the question in the first instance, can there be peace?
Well, sure, because the price of peace can be too high.
Right.
unachievable, right? I mean, listen, you have people like Andy Biggs or Matt Gaetz or Lauren Boebert, right, who didn't like McCarthy in the first place. And in the end, McCarthy got to be Speaker because the Speaker is the winner of a majority vote of people who vote for a person. They never voted for McCarthy. They voted present. And by voting present on the 15th ballot, McCarthy was able to eke out a vote over Jeffries, because these people would never vote for McCarthy. They just didn't vote against McCarthy. They didn't just vote for a third candidate and keep McCarthy below a majority. So at the end of the day, these are not his friends. These are not his fans. These are people who are deeply suspicious of him, and even people who made deals with him, like Chip Roy, for instance, now claim that the deal has been breached. So you have a general skepticism. We can call it an absence of trust. And whether or not that can be papered over, tamped down to the point that you still have a functioning leadership remains to be seen. I mean, most certainly, I think McCarthy and his allies would say that it could be. But here again, you are dealing with people who could be in the category of irreconcilables. It remains to be seen.
Let's talk for a minute about legislatively, sort of the most connected thing to this, obviously, is the appropriations process.
Yeah.
We now have, a top line number that looks a lot like the current fiscal year top line number. We've got 4 women running the appropriations process who are very experienced and very committed to getting these bills done. And I guess we should say up front that part of the deal here is if the 12 bills do not get enacted into law by December 31st, there would be a 1% across the board cut, which nobody except perhaps those 11 members who voted against on the Republican side would want to happen. So a lot of juice in the process to get it done. Obviously, 2 members, 2 senators who are running the process will want to get it done. Did we just see a big increase in the likelihood of getting these 12 appropriations bills enacted into law this year from where we were a few weeks ago? What's your analysis?
Well, I don't know if it's a big increase, but it's an increase. Let me put it this way. Theoretically, all these appropriations bills, all 12 bills, are to pass individually, right? You're not supposed to be passing big omnibus bills, combining 3, 4, 5, even 12 bills into one big bill. Bills are supposed to pass separately. But the last time that happened was 1991.
I was going to say, I think it was my first year in the Senate.
Yeah, 1991, right? And so nobody up there now, with very few exceptions, maybe 4 or 5 people, right? I mean, Patty Murray.
I feel like this is the, steak was a quarter, Coke was a nickel part of the episode.
I mean, Patty Murray is the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and she didn't get elected until 1992.
Right.
Right. So you're talking about a small handful of people, that Grassley, McConnell, who actually even remember the last time that they did this. I think it does create an incentive for them to act. That clearly is so. People will look at that incentive, in the meantime try to think of workarounds to sequesters, right? But they will make an effort to do it. The problem fundamentally, of course, is one of the reasons that appropriations bills haven't gone across the floor in the Senate in recent years is because appropriations bills are must-pass vehicles. Right? And therefore, they invite amendments. They invite people trying to put all kinds of riders on those bills. I mean, there are defenses in the appropriations process, points of order against, riders coming out of left field and so on. But be that as it may, it's a messy process, or it can be a messy process. And that's a problem for Schumer in terms of trying to bring forward those bills across the floor. And not just Schumer. Mitch McConnell faced the same thing, and Harry Reid faced the same thing over those years, which is why they didn't bring the bills across the floor. So messy is the name of the word, and you're talking about 12 bills. And if you don't pass all 12 bills, suppose you pass 10 bills, You didn't pass 12 bills. Now you got the 1% sequester. So it's a gun to the head of the Congress to go ahead and try to pass the individual bills. I think it's an incentive. Whether or not it actually happens, I'm a bit skeptical.
Yeah, I'm with you. I do think there are other things at play here countervailing, which is one, obviously the House is going to load up these bills with a lot of riders that Senate can't take. And we've just seen how reticent the House is to negotiate away, things that they've gotten. You can multiply the debt deal by, 100 in terms of the complexity of the number of riders and the complexity of the riders. So it's a lot to get through that. And then, even on the funding side, obviously there's going to be the dividing of the pie among the 12 bills. And even if we have a sense of where we're going to end up on DOD, how much money EPA gets, how much money the Department of Health and Human Services get, et cetera, will be major points of difference between the House and the Senate. And all of those things take some degree of willingness and goodwill, not only between the House and the Senate, or between the Democrats and Republicans, but between the House and the Senate. And as you just noted, many Senate Republicans are closer to Senate Democrats than they are to the House Republican position on a lot of these issues. So that in and of itself is going to be entertaining to watch, but also somewhat troublesome for getting a final deal.
Rich, I think you just nailed a number of the major reasons why I'm very skeptical this will happen. Okay. Well, one thing I'm not skeptical of, though, is an effort to mitigate the sequester. Let's just hypothesize for the moment that they have passed a majority of the bills. Maybe not by October 1st, but by January 1st. They passed a majority of the bill, but there's still some outstanding questions. And the sequester doesn't apply to the unpassed bills. The sequester applies to a whole thing. So it's really very burdensome. And I would think that facing that kind of trauma, they will pass remedial legislation to give themselves relief from it. I mean, the Congress that created those rules is the Congress that can evade them. And so I would imagine that they will make an effort to evade them because to apply a sequester to legislation that has already passed, where they've done the job, right, seems untoward.
Well, on that happy note, you've wasted another perfectly good hour of your time with the Koch brothers here. And thanks very much for joining us today, and appreciate the handing over of the mic to us as well. Hopefully you found it both entertaining and factually interesting. We will hopefully be back sometime again. If you never hear from us again, obviously you know that it wasn't as popular as we hoped it would be. So have a good day, everybody, and thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.